Now, the Battle of Five Armies was the climax of the Hobbit book. It was a massive battle that involved the forces of the wargs and goblins of Moria, orcs from Gundabad, and especially the orcs from the Misty Mountain, who were, shall we say, slightly miffed that Gandalf slew their leader, the Great Goblin, while the dwarves were the guests of the goblins of the Misty Mountains. When they were trying to make the trek over that mountain range from Rivendell into the wildlands beyond. On the other side involved the survivors of the men of Long Lake, Lake Town, which was crushed in the ruin of Smaug, but before that was burning down their city and slaughtering everyone he could get his hands on. The elves of Mirkwood, who came to their aid, and the dwarves, not just Thorin's band, but also 500 dwarves from the Iron Hills, led by Dane Ironfoot, who had been called by Thorin using the ravens of the Misty Mountain, or the Lonely Mountain rather, to summon reinforcements to help break the bloodless siege that had settled in around the Lonely Mountain. And later in the battle, they would all be joined by the Eagles of the Misty Mountains, which I feel like there's more than 5 armies there, because the Goblins of Moria, Gundabad, and the Misty Mountains are distinct factions, so I would say it's probably more along the lines of the Battle of 8 armies, but whatever, I won't argue with Tolkien. And this is a battle that came in the aftermath of the destruction of Smaug. As I said, he destroyed Lake Town in his ruin when he was shot out of the sky by Bard. But Smaug, just in case you don't, for some reason you don't know who Smaug was. Smaug was one of the few great dragons left in Middle Earth, who had destroyed not only the dwarven kingdom of Erebor, but also that of Dale many years before, driving Thorin Oakenshield and the Longbeards into exile and out of the north. He stole all of the treasure of Erebor and Dale and gathered it inside of the mountain and just lived. He just sat on it. It was the most pointless act of destruction and spite I think I've ever seen, but that's what dragons do. And the Wood Elves, of course, learned that Smaug was dead, and not only did they want to help the Lake Men, because they heard of what had been going on, because they're close trading partners with the Men of Esgaroth, they also wanted a share of the dwarves' ancient treasure, which you are going to find is a very common theme in this battle, is the greed for gold. The surviving men of Long Lake, of course, also marched towards the mountain, thinking that the treasure was undefended, wanting their fair share as well. All admittedly so that they could rebuild their lives, which had been destroyed by helping the dwarves reclaim the treasure in the first place. And Thorin's company, therefore being trapped in a bloodless siege by Thorin's blatant refusal to share any of his treasure with the groups before him, especially not the elves, who they had imprisoned him. But the goal of Thranduil and Bard was to force the dwarves to share the treasure by trapping them inside the fortress, obviously without any access to supplies, food, water, that sort of thing. So, unfortunately, Thorin managed to get messages to his relatives, and the closest relative was Dane II, also known as Ironfoot, from the nearby Iron Hills, and he marched with over 500 heavily armed dwarves, many of them who were skilled veterans of the War of the Dwarves and Orcs. We may actually do a series on that later, because it's a pretty significant conflict, and you see a lot of it in The Hobbit, or at least allusions to it, and you do see it visually in the movies. A quick breakdown is it's basically a genocidal war between the dwarves and the orcs. Surprise! But you see snippets of it from the battle, the climactic battle of that conflict, the Battle of Anazulbazar, where not only was Thorin's grandfather killed and his father driven mad, and one of the dwarven rings of power lost, but Azog, the goblin, was also killed, and the hatred for especially the Longbeards, but the dwarves in general, was instilled in the orcs, and that's part of the reason why the dwarves of Gundabad, for example, wanted to join in on this, and why Bolg was their leader, because he was the son of Azog the Defiler. So he had some personal stakes in this as well.